she is from, yeah.
Sure, sure. Oh, in any case, yeah, it's lovely to meet you all. This is the first time that I am doing a webinar like this, and I'm very pleased because I'm talking with like-minded um, women from across the world who are passionate about making this world a better place, making this world more sustainable, who believe you know that we all have a role to play. um, and so yes, thank you once again. I just want to start with my personal story. uh, I was born to Tibetan refugee parents in India. My parents were part of the first wave of refugees who came to India after the invasion of our country, Tibet, by the Chinese communist government in 1959, 1950. China invaded Tibet a year after the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1959. And in 1959, His Holiness Dalai Lama, who was the spiritual and the political leader of Tibet, he had to leave our country. He had to leave and escape to India and seek refuge. And so thousands of Tibetans, including my parents and grandparents, followed our leader, and fled into exile. And so for the last 60 odd years, Tibetans have built the most resilient refugee community, largely based in India. But in the last 10, 20, 30 years, many Tibetans also started moving to the West, including to countries like Australia. And this is where I am at the moment. I've been in Australia for the last 13, 14 years. I was born in a Tibetan refugee settlement called Bailakupi. For those of you in India, you will know the beautiful city of Mysore in Karnataka. So I was born in a small Tibetan refugee camp near Mysore. It's a place called Bailakupi, which is the biggest Tibetan settlement in India. And then I went to study in a Tibetan boarding school called Tibetan Children's Village, which was in Dharamsala in northern India. And that is where the Tibetan Government-in-Exile, and that is where His Holiness Dalai Lama has lived for the last 60 years. So since coming into exile, His Holiness Dalai Lama and all the older generation of Tibetan refugees have worked very hard to build a refugee community, a strong refugee community, where we are able to preserve our culture, our rich culture, our unique culture, but at the same time we are able to receive modern education. Hello. Sorry, is it okay? Can you hear me well? So yes,
Please carry on. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So so from the very beginning, the Dalai Lama was visionary enough to ensure that we not only were able to maintain a strong culture, but we were also able to receive the best modern education. And he worked very hard to ensure that we had schools, we had hospitals, we had and most importantly, he established the Tibetan Government-in-Exile. And as far as I know, Tibet is the only country to have this government in exile, and we are extremely grateful to the Indian government for providing us with land, providing us all the opportunities to set up a government in exile, to set up our schools, to set up our towns, our settlements, our monasteries, and the Dalai Lama was the political and the spiritual leader of Tibet, but he knew that for the Tibet issue to continue, for us to be able to maintain and sustain and continue the struggle for freedom in our country, Tibet, it's very important that people are educated. It's also very important that we have a democratic system of government where people, where the political leader is directly elected by the people, so that and that we have an election every few years. So over the last 50 years, he has been introducing lots of democratic reforms in our community. We have a government in exile that has all the three pillars of a democratic government, which is the executive, the cabinet, the prime minister and his team. We have the parliament, and we have the judiciary. And as part of a government in exile, we have all the departments like education, religious and culture, security and defense, home affairs, health, all these various departments that are designed to look after the Tibetan refugees in India and around the world. But our government in exile in India is not just for the welfare of the Tibetan refugees. The main goal is to able to restore freedom in Tibet. And so I just want to talk briefly about what is happening in Tibet. I'm sure many of you are aware that since the occupation of Tibet by China, the Tibetan people have lost their basic human rights. They have lost their land, and the Chinese government not only denies Tibetan people the right to practice our religion freely, our culture, our language, our way of life, but also it has done great damage to the environment. And I think this is something that will be of interest to the network here. Tibet, as you know, is important from a global environmental perspective. Tibet, as you know, is the source of all the major rivers in Asia. You talk about the Brahmaputra and the Ganges that flow into India, it starts in Tibet. You talk about the Indus in Pakistan, it starts from Tibet. You talk about the Mekong, which flows into Southeast Asia, it starts in Tibet. In the Irrawaddy in Burma, the Salween, again in Southeast Asia, and even the Yangtze and the Yellow River, that flows into China, they all start from Tibet. So Tibet is called Asia's water tower. And 1.4 billion people out of the 7 billion population in this world depend on the water that originates from Tibet. So this comes back to why China invaded Tibet in the first place. In the last century, all wars were fought over oil, but then water is such a significant resource, and China now has control over all these rivers that originates from Tibet. Likewise, Tibet is also a country that is very rich in mineral resources. It has over 100 different types of natural resources, from copper to gold to iron to chromium to even the lithium that is in the mobile phones, that is in the tablets. A chunk of it comes from Tibet. So, and also, Tibet is such a big land with a very small population. So, and again, talking about the environment, Tibet is being the source of all these major rivers, Tibet also has the largest reserve of fresh water outside the Antarctic and the Arctic. So outside these two polar regions, Tibet has the largest reserve of fresh water. But now what is happening in Tibet, with climate change, a lot of glaciers in these mountains. When you think about Tibet, I'm sure you will, think of the mountains, the snow mountains, but then sadly, with global warming, with climate change, a lot of these glaciers are melting from the Tibetan mountains. And because of this, it affects the flow of the rivers. And so what happens in Tibet, on the Tibetan plateau, affects all these people in all these Asian countries. And Tibet also is the highest plateau in the world. And by that, because of that, it also controls the monsoon patterns in India and in a lot of other countries in Asia. So it's very important that, we, protect the fragile environment of Tibet. But China, what it's doing, instead of, looking after the environment, it is, its policies is directly impacting this fragile environment. It is mining, it is building massive dams to divert water from Tibet to its various cities up north. And because of these unregulated mining and damming projects, it is causing great damage to the Tibetan environment. So, just looking at the time, I don't want to, make my presentation very long, because I was hoping that we can have more interaction, and I think that'll be more enjoyable. Otherwise, it can get a bit monotonous. So lastly, I just want to, end that, yes, on the one hand, when people talk about Tibet, it's a very sad story. It's a tragic story about a people, dispossessed, people not having the basic human rights, people not, people who are forced to flee into exile. But then on the other hand, it is a very inspiring story what Tibetans are doing. China, despite the Chinese government's oppression, Tibetan people inside Tibet has not given up their desire for freedom. Tibetan people's resistance is still very strong. And our struggle has continued from one generation to the next. Tibetans both inside and outside Tibet are very committed to the struggle. And this is what I do here in Australia. I work with Australia Tibet Council, which is an organization that is campaigning for freedom and human rights, and we are part of the global Tibet movement. Around the world, there are groups in every country, in pretty much every country, who are lobbying their governments, who are driving international support for the Tibet cause. And we believe that it is very important for the international community to support Tibet. Yes, it is a moral issue. We are talking about freedom, we are talking about justice, we are talking about human rights, but at the same time it is also and also Tibetans are telling a very positive story. We are fighting for our freedom and independence through non-violence. We are, people today in the world. There's a lot of violence. Conflicts are resolved by. Hello, can you hear me well? But what Tibetans are doing, we are committed to non-violence. We So yes, it's very important that the world supports this non-violent struggle for justice and freedom, but also as I just outlined before, Tibet is also an important strategic issue from an environmental perspective, and it is located between two big Asian countries, India and China. Um, so it has acted as a buffer state between these two countries, and for peace and stability in Asia and around the world, it's very important that the issue of Tibet is resolved. So I just end here, and would like to take questions and have a proper discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyinzom. You have given us the insights of your Tibetan exile and the government and how you democratically you move on. So we can move on with the question answer round. So anybody has any questions regarding this?
I have a question, and not like question, but I have a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very amazed to know about the beginning of Indus River, because Indus river in Pakistan is known as the basic river to run the whole the country, and it is the largest river in the Pakistan. So it's a pleasure for me to know that it's starting from your side. So thank you
Yes.
so much for that. And one thing more, I want to know that your state is a now is a free state.
Sorry, say that again.
Uh, I'm asking that Tibet is a free state now.
No, we are still not free. That's what we are fighting for. We are fighting to get our country back from China. It is still an occupied territory of China.
Yes, I think if we, I think Tibet is bigger than China, and China has more population, so they need more land. Even they need land from India also. So they're trying to invade everywhere for more and more land.
Yes. So, if you look at China, 1/4 of China today is actually Tibet. So that's how big Tibet was, and that's how small China originally was. So today, if you just Google map of China, and if you just consider 1/4 of that
China.
country is actually Tibet. So Tibet lies on the west. So this is China, this is Tibet, then it's Nepal, India, Pakistan, Burma, Thailand, um, and the Chinese word for Tibet is actually called Xizang, which means Western Treasure House. Xizang because it lies on the west of China, and Treasure House because it is rich in the mineral resources. So that's what happens when countries go around the world, when empires go around the world to occupy and invade, they usually do it for, for natural resources.
And we heard that in China there is a huge population of women participation in the parliament. So, do you agree with this? That if you are the part of the China, so do you have a great participation in the parliament?
No, right. So because Tibet is controlled by China, uh, you know, so what China did was, after it invaded Tibet, it divided Tibet into various regions. So Tibet traditionally has 3 provinces: Yuzhang, which is the central province, and then there is Amdo and Kham on the Chinese side of the border. So these are the three traditional provinces, or the three states of Tibet. They divided these these provinces, and they created a region called Tibet Autonomous Region. And then the rest of Tibet, they annexed it into Chinese provinces. So for the last 60 years, the main person ruling Tibet has always been a Chinese, ethnic Chinese person. A real ethnic Tibetan has never been in the top position in Tibet. So, it's a Chinese leader in Tibet who is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing.
Okay. So, yes, how can Tibetan be the top leader of China, because they have invaded the country, so they will always try to rule in their own way. So anybody else want to?
Gia.
Yeah, Gia.
Gia from the Philippines. Kyinzom, we also have problems with China here in the Philippines, especially now with this present administration. But, well, my question about Tibet would be, where is the Dalai Lama ruling from?
He is based in Dharamsala, in Himachal Pradesh, in northern India.
Okay. How would the people of Tibet residing in Tibet right now recognize him? How do they recognize him, the Dalai Lama?
That's a very good question. So, even though Tibetans in Tibet has not met or seen His Holiness Dalai Lama for the last 60 years, they are still very devoted to His Holiness. And in fact, the dream of every Tibetan, I can say, in Tibet is to see the Dalai Lama in their lifetime. And over the last many decades, most of the Tibetans who have left Tibet, they left Tibet in order to see the Dalai Lama in exile. But what happens is, in the last 10 years or so, since the big uprising in Tibet happened in 2008 during the Beijing Olympics, China has cracked down. So Tibetans are not able to travel freely out of Tibet. They are not able to visit their relatives outside Tibet. And for the last nearly 10 years, a lot of Tibetans, because they do not have the freedom to express their feelings, their views, a lot of them are getting desperate and are burning themselves, are self-immolating as a means of protest. You might have heard about Tibetans setting their own bodies on fire to draw attention to the situation in Tibet. And all the Tibetan protesters who have done that, and all the protests that happen in Tibet, one of their key slogans is to call the Dalai Lama to return home. So, so yes, in nutshell, it's the Dalai Lama, who is still regarded as their main leader. The Chinese government is not recognized by the Tibetan people. They do not have the legitimacy inside Tibet, but people are not able to say it, because saying it, expressing their views, means getting arrested and spending many years in jail, getting tortured.
That is very, very frustrating way. I think Hong Kong
Yes.
right now is fighting for the same reason, that although they are a territory of China, they want an independent government from China, which they don't have. So that's why we had the protest happening in the last 10 years by young people. Well, the
Yes.
old Chinese will not, because they're practically relatives. So I think the elder ones will be hesitant to really go on arms against the big China, for that matter.
Yes.
China has also been doing havoc in the Southeast Asia, if you would know about their claim for the nine
Yes.
dash, yes,
Yes.
with the South China Sea. And they
Yes.
have been claiming. So they're practically putting up a big military base in one of our reefs. Imagine, this reef is about less than 200 kilometers away from our shores.
Mm.
And it is within Philippine territory, and
Mm-hmm.
they are able to now construct a
Mm-hmm.
big military base, and it's now operating. Well,
Mm-hmm.
sadly, it has progressed 100 times in the last 2 years when our
Yes.
government succumbed to their whims, their desire. And that
Yes.
is our problem in the Philippines. Also,
Yes.
they like
Definitely.
to control South China Sea because of the natural resources. It's the
Mm-hmm.
same.
Yes. Yes, and now China, I mean, you're talking about how it is asserting its control in Asia, in the South China Sea. It's doing the same everywhere around the world. You know, it is trying to influence domestic politics in various countries, including Australia. Um, so yes, it's everywhere. So it's something that, you know, the world should take note of and make sure that, you know, the Chinese government, an authoritarian, repressive government that doesn't believe in human rights, that doesn't believe in environment protection, um, that does not believe in democracy, that doesn't believe in justice and fairness. You know, they are trying to change the world. So it's very important that countries stand up to China and you know, stand up for its principles.
I think that's one of the that's one political matter that we have to undertake also with the global Greens for
Mm-hmm.
this. Yes. Have you met the Greens in Australia?
Yes, I've actually just walked out of my meetings, members here.
Oh, so you're with the Greens in Australia?
Yes.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, thank you.
Hello, this is Viv Glance, the Australian Greens International Secretary. Sorry I was late joining the meeting. I didn't realise you were actually in Australia. Whereabouts are you?
I am based in Sydney, but today I've come to Canberra to meet members of Parliament. I come to Canberra a few times in a year just to, you know, lobby politicians, brief them on the situation on Tibet, and then, you know, work with them to build stronger political support for the Tibet cause.
So I'm assuming you are in touch with Senator Richard Di Natale's office. He's our Foreign Affairs spokesperson.
Yes, I haven't met Senator Di Natale today. My meeting this afternoon was with Larissa Waters, Senator Larissa Waters. Yes,
Okay.
but yes, I've met his advisors in the past.
Yeah,
Last year.
because I suppose, as you're probably very much aware, one of the big problems that Australia faces, and I mean, I'm not necessarily saying I support this at all, is the actual economic ties. And this is one of the ways that China, in true colonial tradition, manages to manipulate and in some ways control other countries, is through economic ties and economic dependencies. And it does seem very much so that Australia, particularly with our resource extraction and exports, is incredibly dependent on China and also we import a huge amount as well. So it's a kind of very connected, complex situation, which unfortunately doesn't seem to be something that could be happening very quickly. But I mean, I fully support all the UN resolutions around independence and self-determination, and you know, and hopefully that if we are able to move towards a more progressive government at a federal level in the next few months, we'll be able to a bit more progress some of these issues. But do you have any possible insights or suggestions as to how we can resolve this at that sort of economic level? Because that's the one that's really stopping most people from acting.
Yes, I mean, that's the main challenge I have here while talking to politicians, you know, this sense of, you know, heavy dependence on China. And it's a very uneven relationship. But then, you know, just because you are doing trade with the country, it doesn't mean that you should also, you know, compromise on your basic values. And one way to do that, you know, is to, you know, diversify. You know, it's not, you can't just rely on China, because China is not a stable country. You know, the foundations on which it has built its economy, the foundations on which it has built its society is not stable at all. And I was actually talking to a parliamentarian this afternoon, and she was saying that actually, you know, a lot of government people are actually, you know, thinking about that it's not, it's risky actually to, you know, to have this, you know, very heavy dependence on just one country alone. You know, it's like, you know, putting all your eggs in one basket. Whereas, you know, if you start looking for, you know, economic relationships with other countries, for instance, India, which is, you know, a very strong, prosperous, has a country with a lot of potential. You know, people are educated, it's a big population, you know, very strong culture, democratic. So, you know, there's much to gain for Australia, you know, if it starts developing stronger relationships with other countries, you know, like India, Indonesia, you know, with lots of other Southeast Asian countries who are doing very well. So yes, and it's not, basically not safe to just rely on China, because China, you know, on the surface, it may look like a very strong, powerful country, but then, yes, the foundation is not strong at all. So, you know, Tibetans believe that even though it may seem very difficult at the moment, you know, the prospect of us being able to get our country back, it may seem the prospect may seem very remote, but at the same time, we are very confident that, you know, what is happening in China, the power structure, it's not sustainable at all. And Tibetans are prepared for the long haul, which is why we invest a lot of our energy in education, which is why we invest a lot of our efforts in democracy, ensuring that, you know, our systems are democratic, ensuring that our struggle is resilient, our community is resilient, our culture is strong, our language is strong, even though, you know, inside Tibet, all these things, you know, culture, language, the freedom, all these things, the way of life, the land, the environment, everything is being systematically destroyed. But outside Tibet, Tibetan refugees like myself, we are part of a very committed, strong global movement.
Yes, thank you for that. This might be slightly off topic, and I apologize if you mentioned it earlier when I wasn't able to get here. But obviously globally, there's the pressing issue of climate change. And I wondered if, apart from what that potentially has in terms of affecting economies of countries, how is that affecting Tibet at the moment? And is that
Yes.
something that is also going to become an issue for your country's safety in the future?
Oh, definitely. I was just talking about that, this group being a Greens network. I thought it is of particular interest to you all. And Tibet is very important for the global environment. Just to give you points, it is the source of all the major rivers in Asia. All the 10 major rivers in Asia, from Pakistan, India, Burma, Vietnam, Thailand, even in China, the Yangtze and the river that flows in these countries, they originate from India, from Tibet, sorry. And the mountains in Tibet, the glaciers in Tibet, they are the source of Tibet basically has the largest reserve of fresh water outside of the Antarctic and the Arctic. But China, because it has control over Tibet, it has control over all these major rivers of Asia. And they're damming, they're building massive dam projects. Likewise, Tibet also has lots of mineral resources, natural resources. The Chinese word for Tibet is called Western Treasure House. This is because Tibet has lots of natural resources and is located on the west of China. So it's called Western Treasure House. And because of these mining projects, because of these unregulated damming projects, it is harming Tibet's environment. Tibet has a very fragile environment, a very unique environment. The Tibetan Plateau is the highest plateau in the world, which, because of its location, it controls the monsoon patterns in Asia. And so what is happening in Tibet actually does not just affect the Tibetan people, but also all these Asian countries. And, Tibet is at the forefront of climate change, global climate change. These glaciers are melting at a rapid pace. Tibet has lots of grasslands everywhere, which is good for the world, because grasslands, as you know, stores carbon. Tibetan people, especially the nomads, the traditional people of Tibet, 1/3 of Tibet is actually nomads, people who have lived a sustainable way of life, people who have lived very closely with their environment, in a very sustainable lifestyle for centuries and centuries. But now, for the last 10, 20 years, the Chinese government has been forcing these nomads, these traditional herders of Tibet, from their ancestral land, making way for development. So yes, Tibetan nomads who have lived off their land, who have led a sustainable life, they are being removed from their land, and they are now being robbed of their traditional livelihood, of their ancestral home, and put in settlements, urban centers. And these nomads have left a traditional lifestyle for generations. They don't have the skills, social skills, to survive and start a new life in an urban environment. So there are all sorts of social problems. They are economically, socially marginalized in their own country. So yes, environment is a big issue facing Tibet.
So how can we help your country?
So it's basically, first of all, it's to start with awareness raising. A lot of people today don't know about Tibet. So and what happened is, in the last 10 years, 20 years, China has invested a lot of resources in propaganda, in shutting down the voices of Tibetans, on the global stage. For instance, wherever the Dalai Lama goes, the Chinese government lobbies governments, lobbies parliaments, and tell these politicians, these political leaders, not to meet with the Dalai Lama, not to hear from the Dalai Lama. Likewise, China sends its delegations from Tibet, and goes to parliaments around the world, to governments around the world, basically telling lies, propaganda, saying that everything is fine in Tibet. So a lot of people are being caught up in that propaganda and don't really know the real story. So the first thing you can help us is to help us raise the awareness, and to give platforms to Tibetan voices, and which is what you are doing today, giving me an opportunity to share my story, the story of my people, our struggle, and then to lobby your government, make sure that they also understand what is happening to Tibet. Not just affects the Tibetans, but it's also an important issue for your country because of the resources, the water issue, because of the environment issue, and also just for world peace, for justice, for all these values and principles that we believe in, and the fact that Tibetans are actually have a very good positive story, that in a world which is driven by hatred, violence, greed, Tibetans are actually showing that there is a better world. We have a problem, we don't have the freedom, but we are not resorting to violence. We have committed to non-violence. We are fighting for justice peacefully, and it's very important that the international community supports this peaceful struggle for justice and human rights, because if you don't, then what it says is that you are not supporting nonviolence. What it says is that world governments will only take action when people resort to violence, and that's not a good message. So yes, if you can help us spread our message, hear our stories, and make sure that your leaders, your governments also stand up to China, because as China becomes more integrated into the international community, it has to be a responsible member of the international community. And for China to win the respect of the international community, it has to fix the problem in Tibet. The same situation, I'm a Tibetan, so I'm talking about Tibet, but the same situation applies to the Uyghurs situation. Exactly the same. Just as China invaded Tibet in 1950, China also invaded Uyghurs, Xinjiang. The Chinese word is called Xinjiang, but the original name is called East Turkestan. These days, people don't use the word East Turkestan. Everyone uses the word Xinjiang, but it's actually East Turkestan. The independent country is East Turkestan. So Uyghurs also, it's a Muslim-dominated country. Beautiful culture, beautiful people, had its own culture, land, but also very rich in resources. So that's Xinjiang or East Turkestan, that's Tibet, and that's China. So China came, invaded Tibet, then they invaded Xinjiang or East Turkestan. And the situation is exactly the same, in fact, worse to some extent. Because because it's a Muslim-dominated country, they are the Chinese government, they find it very easy to target them. Whatever resistant movement that is taking place in East Turkestan, they are very quick to label them as terrorists. Whereas the Tibetans, being Buddhists, and we are very lucky to have a leader like His Holiness Dalai Lama, who is well respected by the international community, who is the global icon of peace and nonviolence and compassion. Naturally, the international community is a lot more sympathetic to our struggle. But yes, Xinjiang also needs the support from the international community.
You know, I'm feeling you, because right now in the Philippines, we can see the invasion of China in our country right now. Even with population-wise, in the past 2 years, we have now more than 3 million undocumented Chinese people coming to our metro cities. And surprisingly, these people come in with nothing. They come in as merchandisers and everything, but basically they don't know how to deal with people, and they are the one causing troubles now in our small community. And I think China is slowly doing it and taking advantage of our unfunctioning government in the Philippines right now. I think there is an invasion of China in our country now. I'm very, very thankful to have heard your side.
Thank you.
So, Kyinzom, that was a wonderful discussion about Tibet. And yes, most of us don't know the insights of Tibet, what they are facing because of the China government. And yes, India has always been with Tibet, and we will be always with Tibet. And let's find out let's work out how we can work together as a Green Party and Tibetan Exile. So anybody else has any questions, or I think mostly we have discussed.
So Viv, where are you based?
Yes, hello, I'm based over in Perth.
Okay.
So, but yes, I'm sort of in touch with everybody around the country through the Global Issues Working Group, which is the international issues group that we have here.
Okay. So are you part of the international team? Do you work with Michelle?
I'm on the International Development Committee, yes, which is what Michelle. Yes. Oh, you know Michelle? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Good. Yes, so we're trying to do what we can as an international group.
So yes, thank you for organizing this.
Yes, I would like to thank you, Kyinzom, for being the speaker of October webinar. Thank you very much, and thank you all the participants for being part of this webinar. Thank you very much, and we do invite you for the next webinar we have on 24th of same date next month, same time.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyinzom. Get in touch with the Green in Australia.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.